Well, welcome. I'm Aaron Stauffer, the Louisville Institute postdoctoral fellow at the Wendland-Cook Program at Vanderbilt Divinity School. And welcome to the final Engaging Christianities and Socialisms webinar, What is to be Done? We're excited you're here, and we've really got an amazing panel lined up for us tonight. As I said, I'm Aaron Stauffer, and I'm with the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt Divinity School. The Wendland-Cook Program, along with the Institute for Christian Socialism, are tonight's sponsors, and we're really excited that you're here. Before I introduce the panelists, I wanted to set the stage briefly and give you a sense of how you can participate in the webinar. So first, feel free to use the chat and introduce yourself to our fellow attendees. We always like to see where people are coming from and to hear your reactions. The panelists and those of us who are on the back end here of the webinar, really appreciate your comments and do take them seriously. So feel free to let us know where you're coming from. I'm hoping that we'll have time for questions at the end of the program tonight. So as the program continues and you've got a question that pops into your head, feel free to use the Q&A function. But also, if you see a question that you'd especially like to have answered, make sure you vote for it so that we can see that it's the most popular and really the most urgent that we should get to. The Engaging Christianities and Socialism series arose out of a fundamental unease in the state of our economic, political, and religious options today. We see deep economic inequalities only heightened by the pandemic, where working people are once again placed at the mercy of a capitalist system that prizes profit and shareholders over working people's lives and our planet. Our political democracy at point seems to be merely democracy in names only, with our politicians being at the mercy of the moneyed elite. And our religious leaders, more often than not, offer excuses for the current quagmire of troubles and suffering that late modern capitalism has created. But we at the Wendland-Cook Program and the Institute for Christian Socialism know that the current reality is not our only option. Over the course of the 3 webinars we've held this spring, we've highlighted working people's movements in response to the evils of capitalism and rising white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and ecological destruction. But often, as we're fond of saying, religion is also part of the problem. The answer cannot be merely to offer religion as a panacea to our economic and political challenges. Instead, religion itself must be transformed into a deeper resource for liberation movements today. This is why throughout this series, we've not only examined various economic and political responses found in socialisms broadly, but we've also examined how a commitment to democratic socialism and economic democracy can change our religious expressions. Christianity can make a difference within people's movements for greater economic and political democracy, but it takes the right sort of religious vision and expression for it to make the right sort of difference. So in the first webinar, we explored this relationship broadly. What do Christianity and socialism have to do with each other? With Cornel West, Joerg Rieger, Cynthia Mulabeda, and Angela Kauser, we had a fantastic conversation that set us in the right direction. And the link to that webinar will be placed in the chat here shortly if it's not already. In the second webinar, we explored the challenges of building deep solidarity. Timothy Eberhardt, Jeremy Posadas, Aubrey Hendricks, Sarah New, and Josh Davis argued that intersectional analysis, an analysis that argues for the liberation of all people and all of the planet's biodiversity, is part and parcel of this movement. But now, tonight, we get to the fundamental question: what is to be done? How can Christian socialists today join all working people to build religious, economic, and political democracies? And what are the unique strengths that Christian socialists might bring to these action-oriented movements? I don't assume that we'll be able to ultimately solve this problem, as it's a question that's been on the mind of Christian socialists for a long time. But we've got the right sort of panelists to get started. And without further ado, let's introduce them. Jessica Gordon-Nemhard is a professor of community justice and social economic development in the Department of African Studies at John Jay College of the City of University of New York. She's also the director of the McNair Post-Baccalaureate Achievement Program. Her research and publications explore problematics and alternative solutions in cooperative economics and worker ownership, community economic development, wealth inequality, and community-based asset building and community-based approaches to justice. She's recently completed a book on Black cooperatives which everyone should read, Collective Courage, A History of African-American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. Jessica, thank you so much for being here. Our next panelist is Andrew Wilkes. He's the co-pastor of the Double Love Experience in Brooklyn, New York, and he's also a PhD student in political science at CUNY Graduate Center and the former executive director of the Drum Major Institute, a social change organization started by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Andrew, thank you so much for being here. I should also mention that you're on the advisory board of the Institute for Christian Socialism. So really glad you're here. Micah Utrecht is the deputy director of Jacobin and the host of Jacobin's radio podcast, The Vast Majority. He's the author of Strike for America, Chicago Teachers Against Austerity, and the co-author of the just renewed or reissued Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism. So let's welcome our panelists here. If we all can have our videos on, we can have a conversation with each other about this. Again, Jessica, Andrew, and Micah, thank you so much for being here. I really want to start with history. That's where I want to start. So Jessica, I want to start with you. It's for anybody who's been paying attention recently through the patient and consistent long-term organizing, democratic socialism ends religious socialisms, and then Black radical critiques of the economy and politics have finally hacked their way back into the mainstream. They're now becoming an alternative that people in mainstream news media are thinking about, talking about. But the political and economic challenges that lie ahead for economic democracy are not new. When facing these challenges of entrenched, corrupt economic and political systems, it does help to draw inspiration and tactics and strategies from the past. And one underappreciated struggle is the history of Black economic democracy and the role that Black churches have played in supporting these cooperative movements. So can you start off by giving us a brief overview of some of the lessons from the Black religious movements for economic democracy?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. And I do also want to start with a land acknowledgement and acknowledge the original stewards of the land. Where I am in New York City, it's Lenape Nation land. Hopefully you all know what land you're on. And I also want to just acknowledge our ancestors, my ancestors in particular, and bring them into the room with us. Yeah, I was really fascinated when I started looking into African-American co-op history, because at first no one could really tell me that there was a history, and that made no sense to me. So when I went to look, try to find out what I could, right, I actually was able to start with W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote a book in 1907 on it. And he was the one actually who led me to mutual aid societies and religious institutions. And what he said, and then I obviously found a bunch of other scholars and a lot of other information, was that really the religious camaraderie, that sense of trust and solidarity that was in religious and fraternal organizations, also bled into or connected with economic justice issues. And so the early mutual aid and beneficial societies were often started by religious congregations who were already coming together to address, spiritual and physical needs, and then looking to mutual aid and economic solidarity to address everyday sickness, widow and orphan, death benefits, et cetera. So there's a really strong history. And this, we're talking about from the beginnings of African Americans being brought in chains on US soil, right? So early notions of, this is the humane way to operate together, right? Even in a totally inhumane situation, right? And then by the time we get to the first official Black church, right, the AME church out of Philadelphia, well, it was actually an African mutual aid society that created the AME church. So already there's a connection between Black congregations, mutual aid, and of course, mutual aid is the beginnings of economic cooperation, right? It's the very early, how do you pool your resources together to address a need where everybody gets a say in what happens to those resources, and you pool those resources to help whoever needs the help. And so again, the earliest activities, the mutual aid societies, some of the early credit unions, the early buying clubs were often church, secret society, fraternal organization related, because you had to have some sense of trust and solidarity. And where best to get that? Well, the people you're worshiping with, right? You already know them. You're already doing other stuff with them. You already exchange money because you're being tithed. So you have all those relations, the financial, the social, the spiritual relations are already there. And so it kind of naturally. Now, it doesn't mean every single church did it or every single religious person, but we definitely see that trend, right? And really interesting things in terms of the churches connecting, again, that sort of economic justice, economic agency with health, mental health, and then even revolt, right? Often, again, because you could trust your religious comrades, you often planned your revolts. You could use the gathering place that your congregation had to plan revolts. And so there's all these interconnections based on the fact that you can trust and work with people. To bring it a little bit, more into the 20th century, just quickly, and then I'll give it up so somebody else can get to the next question. The other thing I do want to bring up is how related some even of our modern co-ops are. For example, and this is not Black history, but the Mondragon co-ops that a lot of people talk about, because the Mondragon system of interlocking worker co-ops and a credit union and other co-op development was actually started by a Catholic priest out of a minority population in northern Spain. And Father Arizmendi Arriata was, one of the early liberation theologists. It was period of Franco's horrible reign and despotism in Spain. And Father Arizmendi Arriata, again, took his spirituality, what it means to be a human being, connected it to his economics, and said, there's a better way for us to live and associate with each other economically. He started a school to actually teach cooperative economics, as well as to teach polytechnical skills to students. And those student graduates then created worker co-ops in technical industries. And now, the Arizmendi system has, 160 worker co-ops. They also own a consumer co-op. They have the 7th largest banking system in Spain and things like that. But again, that sense of solidarity, connection, connecting the spiritual humane principles have all really led to a huge interlocking and very solid system of cooperatives, especially worker cooperatives. And then another example here in the US with a group of Blacks in Cincinnati, it was actually the Cincinnati Interfaith Group that started a janitors worker-owned co-op, I think in the late 1990s. And again, so it was a group, an interfaith group who's trying to do interracial and community development stuff in Cincinnati at a time, right? The 90s are a time when, the economy is getting better, but we still have a lot of inner city issues. How do you empower janitors? So again, create a worker co-op where janitors can own their own business, control their own work, control their hours, control their pay, and benefit from owning a company, right? And that company is still in business today. So what's that, almost 30 years, 25 years or something? And again, with help from people who consider themselves, having a spiritual connection with other people in the community, trying to make a difference. So is that enough, or you want some more examples, or should we move on?
Oh, I love that. I think that, thank you. Obviously, what's really wonderful and about the work that you've done here is you've just really given us such a gift of the fact that as you said, when you started, when you looked and you couldn't find anything, and all of a sudden what you've just given us and shown is that this is a history that needs to be told, because this is real struggles that have happened and are continuing. And these stories need to be told so that our political and economic imaginations and religious imaginations can be further inspired. I think the connection between the relationships of trust and solidarity that are already there within a church, and how that is leveraged once people realize that Christianity is about power, economic and political democratic power. Things begin to become possible that people perhaps didn't realize before. So on that point though, Andrew, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, I'm sorry, what I really want to do first is I want to introduce our other panelist here, Ed Whitfield, who just joined us. Ed is a social critic, writer, and community activist. He's the co-manager for the Fund for Democratic Communities. And after 30 years of working in the industry and becoming involved, he's now involved in philanthropy, but he speaks and writes on issues of cooperatives and economic development, while continuing to be interested in issues of war and peace. He's on the boards of the New Economy Coalition, the Working World, and the Southern Reparations Loan Fund. So Ed, thank you so much for being here. This is really a gift to have you here too.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So Andrew, let's keep this rolling. We were just talking about how significant the relational culture and fabric of religious communities is to building economic democracy. But I want to talk a little bit more about today, about how it is that how religious democratic socialists can link up with current movements today. Noting this history, and starting with the experiences of Black churches, how can religious socialists and Christian socialists draw from this deep well of economic and political and religious struggle to keep the fight going today? What do you see?
Yeah, thank you so much for that great question. And again, great to be in conversation with all of you all here today. Just want to underscore and italicize Dr. Gordon Nimhard's book, Collective Courage, is the definitive cartography and map of Black cooperative activity. And you see so much of that in Black churches. There's a kind of latent anti-capitalism when you consider the cooperative traditions. Credit unions are in many churches right here in New York City and many other cities. And a lot of that is born of necessity, right? Folks who have been on the discriminatory end of banking practices have often had to pull together resources in ways that really speak to what I think we find in the Book of Acts, and what interestingly someone like Rosa Luxemburg noticed as a kind of proto communist sort of activity from the consumption side of pooling together resources in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, where folks hold all their possessions in common and put into a pot, right? It's kind of a canonical analogy of from each as ability and distribute to each according to need, right? In terms of your specific question of how churches can get involved and Christian groups generally, there are a few things that I'd say. I think the first is it's important to generously but clearly move beyond the vague invocations of things like building beloved community or with our siblings in wider Abrahamic traditions, Tikkun Olam, talking about repairing the world, but the content is missing there. I think it's important to accent explicitly class-oriented visions of what justice looks like in a way that connects to undoing every manner of hierarchy and oppression. And so what that means is, first, I think we bridge by acknowledging that folks as varied as James Cone, as Dwight Hopkins, and Black liberation theological traditions have pointed towards a kind of political economy that is holistically against white supremacy, against capitalism, and for worker solidarity, for building on those bonds of trust. I'm thinking in particular of Hopkins' shoes that fit our feet, where he draws on the boys to create this kind of constructive commonwealth economy sort of theology. But I think it's also important on this first point of drawing from new theological sources that put more teeth on what love looks like in public when it's conflictual and confronting flows of capital and public investment that always seems to harm all working communities and in the states disproportionately Black and brown and indigenous communities. I think the work of womanist theologians is important to lift up. I think of the anti-capitalist work of Katie Cannon in Womanism and the Soul of Community, where she's grappling with Oliver Cox as she kind of constructs what it looks like to be committed to the healing of entire populations. I think of the work of Dolores Williams as well in that regard, where she talks about Black churches and by extension, all churches as a kind of holy God force that's pushing for justice. I think the theological component, which is not reducible to the ideological, I think that's important to say, is one piece. The second thing that I would note is, I think it's important to affirm the work that happens in a lot of churches, not only Black churches, but kind of mainline churches, of issue-based activism, of community organizing and asset-based development, of voter registration, and to see those as front doors into walking further towards regional planning, so that our cities are not beholden to stadium development politics that extract from the land, extract from our labor, and give us nothing but popcorn and entertainment instead. That's a planning conversation that church folk who believe the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof ought to be concerned about connecting with your new economy coalitions, your DSAs, and your movement for Black lives, which have a class-oriented dimension. And then maybe the last thing I'll say, and then I'll be through. I think it's important to emphasize a common cause that doesn't require us to depreciate the particular theological and cultural traditions that we bring to conversations in order to have multiracial class coalitions towards a kind of socialist economy. And what I mean by that is, it may be that some folks are bringing in Gustavo Gutierrez and John Sobrino. That's wonderful. We welcome them. It may be that other folks are organizing from a kind of Black church context that's pulling on Nanny Helen Burroughs, arguing for Jesus, jobs, and justice, pulling on Reverend D. Ransom, who argues explicitly for socialism in the AME Church Review in the late 1800s. Others may be pulling on Norman Thomas, right, a former Presbyterian minister who ultimately becomes a socialist. But however you come in the front door, we all need to be pushing with aggressive and generous solidarity for economic justice.
Thank you so much for this. I feel like that was, we're already going to church again. So this is just really wonderful. I wanna touch a little bit more though on this last point and bring Ed and Micah here, because I think you've raised a really important question for us. And that is how it is, this question of however it is that you get in the door, right? Moving to deeper regional planning, tackling larger issues besides issue-based campaigns, because issues fade. And so I think that one of my first organizers told me, organizing mentors said, you know, issues fade, values don't. So you've got to be able to ground this organizing in the relational and value basis that I think is just really crucial here. So Micah and Ed, I want to kind of open the door for you to comment on anything that Jessica or Andrew has said about this, particularly here, this last point that Andrew has made around issue-based activism and moving beyond that, and how it is that we can build broader and deeper movements here.
Yeah, I'd like to say something about it, because I think that the question of how we move from our values, how we make real our values in the real world, has a lot to do with the prioritization that we make of some of the economic activity that we need to be engaged in. One of the things that's worth remembering is that the guiding framework of the prevailing, the status quo system is that profit is elevated to a level where it's almost considered sacred. When the accumulated surplus in a community ought to be a tool It ought to be held as instrumental in order to meet people's needs and elevate the quality of life. What in fact happens is that taking the form of profit, this socially produced surplus takes on a sacred life of its own, where it is held to be of value above and beyond everything else, and everything else is taken to be instrumental, including the lives, the question of meaning, alienation, the quality of the environment on the planet. Everything is used up as instrumental in the quest for enhancing that which is held to be sacred, which is profit. So unless you are coming from an anti-capitalist position toward the creation of economies and structures that are different from that, then you are in fact objectively elevating as sacred the accumulation of profit for the purpose of enhancing the vanity, the power, the privilege, and the prestige of a tiny group of people. You know, prosperity theology notwithstanding, that is not my understanding of the Christian way, or in fact, the spiritual way of anything that has a valid claim on spirituality. Now, how do you use people as instrumental for the enhancement of profit, as opposed to looking for ways that we can use profit and accumulated wealth as something that's going to be instrumental for the meeting of the needs, the enhancing of the quality of life of the people themselves? And I just think that this becomes a framework that is made real by the economic and political activity of institutions when they are either supporting the status quo or they are supporting a transformation towards something that is much more humane in the sense of elevating and hold it sacred life and people and the values that I think people would claim to hold sacred. That's my short version of something that I hope is useful.
That was really wonderful. That was really wonderful. Any other final points here before we keep on going? Mike, I want to give you a chance here to talk about some of the things that we've addressed.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly that I spend most of my time despite growing up in the church, in the Lutheran church, son of an ELCA pastor, I operate mostly in the secular world and in the socialist movement through DSA. But what I just heard from Ed is something that I think would be that is incredibly, it's certainly compelling to me. It certainly reflects the kind of Christianity that I grew up with, which is what led me to now be working for a socialist magazine and be organizing with the Democratic Socialists of America. But I also think that it's something that would be, that is particularly compelling to people who have found themselves in this new left that has sprung up in the United States over the last couple of years, who I think for the first time in a while, maybe the left is not, the people who are joining this new left don't seem to find it necessary to, be involved to say that atheism is a sort of like a principal thing that they, we need to disabuse people of these foolish notions of their, the opiate of the masses or whatever. I feel like the people who I hang out with in this newly reborn socialist movement, he would hear the kind of thing that I just said and take that as a kind of morally ironclad and serious statement that that's the reason that they came to socialism in the first place. And if they were to hear Christianity spoken about in that kind of language and see that the Christianity that we're talking about tonight is not some kind of isolated project or the Christianity, they come to associate Christianity with being with fundamentalism, with the kind of right-wing project. People are hungry for that kind of articulation of morals, of political morality. That again, that's why they've come to these new projects of the radical left. They've also not felt like they have gotten those things from contemporary liberalism. They feel like contemporary liberalism, surrounded by in the Democratic Party, has not taken that kind of moral project very seriously, and so that's what they're looking for in socialism, more than any set of particular strategies for how to change the world or descriptions of the science of the capitalist economy. They're looking more than anything else for that kind of moral vision. And so that's a real opportunity, I think, for this kind of Christian socialism that we're here to talk about tonight, to meld with this rising left in this country.
I really appreciate the points you've made right here. And I think it's important for us to be engaged with the reality that the vast majority of people who think about Christianity associate it with the violent insurrection of January 6th and the white nationalism that sort of was literally and metaphorically dawned for that insurrection, the violence there. So it's particularly important that we sort of be clear about the kind of Christianity and the kind of socialisms that we're calling for people to dig into. And I think that's Ed's really drawn some clear points here. So Ed,
there's one more point I want to make, and
yeah,
I was noticing in the chat a number of people were mentioning things about black capitalism. I want to be really, really clear that changing the color of who engages in these exploitative systems does not fundamentally change the nature of what they are and what's wrong with them. That the contradiction I was describing, I did without allusion to the question of the race of the people involved. And that's not because I don't think issues of race and the race of the people involved are not important. I'm just saying, relative to the question of, do we hold profit as being sacred and utilize people in order to make profit, or do we hold people as being sacred and utilize capital as a way of enhancing people? That is a question that we have to take up, and it stands on its own. And changing the race of who is engaged in the practice doesn't fundamentally transform that from being an issue that we have to deal with and take a clear stand on. One of the principles of the Mondragon cooperatives that Jessica mentioned is, in fact, that of utilizing labor as fundamental and capital as instrumental, rather than having capital be fundamental and utilizing labor in order to enhance capital. That's a powerful principle that has a spiritual way that we can talk about it, that I think just makes a lot of difference in terms of what kind of institution should we build and support. Because, making the Black church the owner of the housing development, if indeed the housing development is set up in such a way as to maximize profit, as opposed to offer living opportunities for people in the community, that's still wrong.
Yeah, let me quickly just piggyback on Ed for a second. The more I've been talking about cooperative economics and solidarity economics, the more I'm reminded that these are actually, right, pre-capitalist, pre-mercantilist, right? These are the original ways that human beings have operated together and have solved their survival, right? Their questions of survival and economic management, right? We've done it as collectives, as solidarity people on commons, on common land, right? And we sometimes, because we live in such a highly capitalist system, and capitalism has been in existence for the last 300 to 400 years, and was actually built on the slave system, right? We think it's the only system. We think it's the be all, the end all, but actually it's a latecomer, right? And it's what's destroying our planet, right? And our livelihood. So if we're worried about even climate change, as well as worried about human relations and human liberation, right? We have to go back to how should we, as human beings, right? How should we operate? How should we treat each other? And why does our economics have to be separate from our humanity, right? Because right now we pretty much leave our humanity at the door to any job, any factory, any whatever, right? We're supposed to not be a human being to make a living, to do the work, to then be a human being, right? It makes no sense. So we need to rethink, right? We need to go back to the basics. This is how human beings relate to each other. This is how we perfect ourselves as human beings, by creating the agency to work together, solve problems together, and help everybody and make sure that we're all liberated. And that's the kind of thing I think we're all trying to talk about here.
Really, thank you for that, Jessica. Andrew, please go for it. Yeah.
Just want to hop in on this point, because I think there's a kind of celebrity-oriented diversity pitch of capitalism that gives it its cultural currency. And so when you think about someone like Jay-Z or an Oprah, or insert your latest person, talking about buying back the block. Maybe they slide a little bit of philanthropic support to mass incarceration reduction issues. It gives the veneer that we can keep a system of extraction, exploitation, and accumulation intact if we have new faces, to the point that I think Ed is making, come into play. But what I want to lift up from that are two things. One is, I think E. Franklin Fraser's text, The Black Bourgeoisie, he talks about that kind of approach as a land of make-believe. It feels good. It seems, it's like a candy fantasy to believe that we can have, somebody become a billionaire and then they can just give and take care of things. That's a problem on democratic issues. It's also a problem because it occludes the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, even if they're we sprinkle in a little more color. But the second thing is that there's a kind of popularizing of justice that, at least to some degree, is intentionally broad-based, that certain capitalists do. Whereas sometimes I think there's too much intramural debating and internecine fights among socialists and leftist folks in general. So all of that to say, I think a strategic push towards more popular education, towards more base building, towards, since we're in the theological context, towards more spirit talk, because that's an easier on-ramp for folks than Jesus talk in some settings. Spirit talk can be more multi-faith, more on-ramps for folks who have ethical frameworks, but may not necessarily go to church. It may be a mosque, it may be a temple, it may be an ethical culture society. So I think we need to be strategic about the leading theological frames so that we can debunk some of this make-believe capitalists can, charity our way out of injustice.
Thank you for that, Andrew. Particularly what I really like about your points here are the sort of turn to the practical, right? We've done a lot through this series in the first and the second webinars here about exploring the history of and the utility of these terms and these ideas we're playing here. But I want to start now with Ed. I want to ask, in your experience and in your estimation, what's the first step for people getting involved in movements to build economic democracy and democratic socialism? How can they connect up with this fight? And then also, what's the benefit of religious socialisms in this fight?
The first step is organizing. It's the first step of almost everything. If you're going to build a church, if you're going to build a social group, if you're going to build a neighborhood, you need to organize some people together. We're social creatures. We engage in social production. We also engage in social processes of making meaning. We engage in social processes of collecting food. When we're fortunate, we eat together. So the organizing process is one of the most natural and most necessary parts of any of this. So part of the definition of cooperative economics is that a group of people identify some problem, then they create an entity, an enterprise that can be useful in solving that problem, where they share together in the governance of it, or democratically decide upon the governance structure of it, and they share the benefit from it. That's what a cooperative is. But the first thing I said was a group of people, that the principal underlying primary piece of all of this, the foundation that gives the rest of it possibility, is that you have a group of people who are able to build a relationship with each other, where they can identify a common problem and come up with the common solution that will share the common running of it and share in common the benefits of it. But it has to be that group of people. So in fact, the key part, the foundation of it, is the most obvious, the most immediate, but at some level, almost the most difficult of it. Because one of the factors of the capitalist system is it's torn people away from each other in such a way as to instigate and build distrust, individualism, the notion of rugged individualists who, think that they built their house when they don't know how to make a nail, when they depended on some social process of production to make the nails, to make the pipes, to hew the wood into some usable form, to make the roof. All of that was social stuff. So you didn't do it by yourself. There's almost nothing that you're able to do by yourself. And the question is, what is the relationship you have with the people who you depend upon? And I think that the effort should be to build mutually dependent mutuality. So the whole notion of mutual aid is about the way that we depend on each other and collectively contribute to something from which we collectively benefit. The whole notion of solidarity is a way that we're in this together, that we collectively contribute to a collective solution to our problems, and we live in solidarity with each other. So much of this work is around the solidarity economy, and that solidarity is again rooted in that notion of how we relate to the relationships we build with each other.
Thank you for that. I thought just that, again, like the points that we've made here really circle back to some of what Jessica said at the beginning. You know, the question of what is the relationship you have with the people that you depend upon. Like breaks us from this myth of individualism. And I think the mobilizing and educating and organizing is always the first step. So Micah, I wanna turn to you on this, because you've written recently about this in your book, Bigger Than Bernie. And you talk about how it is that the Bernie Sanders campaign was a structure test for the left. And as I hinted at my questions with Ed here, you know, the fight for economic democracy requires building economic and political power. But the type of organizing that it takes to do that is hard going work. It's not going to be easy. It's slow and patient work. So in your estimation, how can democratic socialists build on the mass mobilization that we've seen in the past year to build sustainable, long-term economic and political power? And what's the role of churches and religion in this work?
So I think that most democratic socialists understand whether or not they're participating in these two institutions. They would argue that the kind of classically on the left, the two most important organs of working class power are the labor union and the political party. Of course, in the United States, we have a uniquely weak labor movement, and we don't have a left-wing political party. We have a capitalist party in the Democrats who sometimes is forced to accommodate demands from unions or from racial justice activists, but is not fundamentally a working class party. And so I think that is what this newly reborn socialist movement in the form of the DSA is principally working on, is trying to rebuild the labor movement, in some cases with activists embedding themselves within shop floors to be shop floor activists within the labor movement, certainly acting in support of labor struggles as they kick off. And then also the electoral piece, which is of course the thing perhaps the main reason why we have a reborn socialist movement in the left is because of the electoral activity of recent years, starting with the Bernie Sanders campaign, but of course going everywhere from folks, socialists running for winning seats in the House to in Chicago, where I'm from, we have half a dozen socialist city council members. From dog catcher to the halls of Congress, there's been this upsurge in socialist electoral activity. And of course, there are many other, you don't need me to give you the long list of all of the, Black Lives Matter protests and immigrant rights protests and fight for a Green New Deal and everything else that are the really crucial fights that are going on right now. And I think the role of churches in this, let's say a couple things about this. One, as I mentioned earlier, that I think there is a real desire to bring churches into these fights on the parts of the largely secular left. There's an understanding that churches are one of the few institutions of basic social infrastructure that we have left in this country. A time in the 21st century when neoliberal capitalism has so hollowed out so much of the social infrastructure in society. We're all so atomized and everything is so individualized. And the labor movement was a crucial tool for building working class power. It was also where you went bowling with your fellow union members on the weekend, and all of the kinds of institutions like that are gone. And so the church, I think, the largely secular socialists today understand that is not anything to sneeze at, that the church still provides that role as a social cohesion in society. And they also understand, I think, that there's a kind of practical purpose to engaging with churches, that because churches are these crucial social institutions that still have this level of cohesion, often within their neighborhoods and also within their denominations, if they have them, etc. That there's a kind of a practical purpose that you can enlist folks at churches to win fights. I mean, I used to be an organizer at Arise Chicago, which is an interfaith worker center that would often, in addition to doing work around fighting for mostly low-wage immigrant workers who had been the victims of wage theft, also mobilize religious support for existing labor movement struggles. And just from a purely practical point of view, not anything else, things felt different when the religious leaders would show up to these struggles, right? And I think people in the labor movement understood that, even if they weren't religious themselves. They're like, well, there's a kind of, again, what I was talking about earlier, a moral seriousness that has been brought to bear. This is not just sort of like a fight between two parties. There's a sort of like, this is a battle between people who are trying to ring in a sort of moral cosmic sense. Like there's sort of like there's a sort of good and evil battle happening here between workers who've already had their wages already having profit extracted from them to line the pockets of someone, and then there's a sort of like added moral injury happening on top of that. So that's the practical angle. But then this moral piece is really can't be understated at this point. That is an essential part of these kinds of struggles to try to build worker power, to add that angle to what's going on. And as I said, I think there are tremendous opportunities for folks who understand their religious calling to be expressed in these political ways. There's tremendous opportunities for those things to be brought together.
Thank you for that, Jessica.
Yeah, I wanted to push back a little bit. We're all being a little Pollyanna-ish. And so I want to, I'll be a little devil's advocate, or maybe that's the wrong word in this conversation. But anyway, I have two different things to push back on. One, even I, was very optimistic about what churches have done and can do and what religious groups can and have done. But we also have this problem of a huge number of conservative and reactionary religious organizations, right? And some of them are even in Black churches, right? And so there are some real problems, right? Churches can be extremely, religious organizations can be extremely hierarchical. They can be extremely patriarchal, right? And so we do have to figure out, right, how do we address those contradictions, right? How do we, right, all the great stuff we've been saying, and it exists, and we have the movements, but we also have these really strong, powerful, anti-progressive religious movements that we have to figure out how to handle them and how to approach them. Because just talking about, the things we're talking about, the spirituality, the fact that they're places where people can socialize, they're places that get organized, they're places that have had a history of doing some stuff, but they also are places that have done the exact opposite. And so I think we also need new words and new wording to talk about some of this stuff, to think about how we're going to usher in the stuff that we're all excited and hopeful about. So I wanted to put that in there. And then I also am wary of putting all of our hopes for economic democracy into politics. And I also have nothing against, right, a socialist party and people, having a socialist party and socialist platforms. But I'm also wary, right, because it's not all going to be solved by politics. I actually believe that a lot of economic democracy has to be practiced and demanded, not legislated. And so I think we also need to try to figure out, right, how do we talk about, sometimes I talk about even anti-racism. We're not going to get there until we have economic justice, right? We're not going to have racial justice without, but we're also can't actually get economic justice without some racial justice. So in some ways, it's a vicious cycle. But what I mean by the practice of economics, some of the the legislative stuff we've seen in the past, if you legislate it before people have practiced it and demanded those kinds of economic relationships, they don't necessarily work the way we want them to. Sometimes you end up with governments forcing people into co-ops and nobody knows what that means. There's no real economic democracy, whatever, but it was legislated, right? So, you know, in my sort of utopia, we have people practicing it first, right? Taking over companies, starting co-ops, taking over, converting their co-ops, practicing it, and then telling the government what more they need, right? What kinds of enabling policies do they need? What funding do they need to do more, to do what they're doing and to do more of it? So that there's more of a bottom up, a more of an agency driven, you know, people doing it and then demanding what else they need to support it. So I just wanted to throw that in to our conversation.
Can I hop in here on this point? I appreciate you stirring the pot a little bit. It's often in the dissonance and the unearthing of contradictions that we can get where we need to go. I'm going to try to make 3 points as quickly as is possible for a preacher to make. Y'all have mercy on me as I try to do so. The first is, I think it's important to lift up movement math, meaning we can do a lot with the creative minority, as Fannie Lou Hamer called it. And just to put that in context, in addition to being a proud member of the Institute for Christian Socialism, also been a proud member for DSA for a long time. DSA has helped reshape the national conversation, and they are like, we've been doing like 100,000 member drive. That's 100,000 people as compared with the number of folks that are in the Republican and Democratic Party is fraction. And yet it's pushed the conversation, right, on Medicare for all, pushed the conversation, Green New Deal, so on and so forth. So with a few, we can get a lot done in shifting conversations and putting new policy options on the table. I think similarly with the Poor People's Campaign and a number of other entities, we've seen how a few people can shift things. That to say, I think Dr. Gordon Hart's point is right, that we are a spirited but numerically small few, and the conservative religious folk, Christians and otherwise, outnumber us, but that doesn't mean that we can't have some degree of efficacy. The second thing that I think is important to name is to put the message in as simple a container as possible without liquidating the content. One conversation I had with Bhaskar Sankara, he made the point that he often talks about, who founded Leeds Jacobin, talks about socialism in a kind of anti-bullying way. And so in the same way that we wouldn't want folks who are queer and gender non-conforming to be bullied in our schools or our churches, right? Let's go there, or faith communities. We also don't want a political system or an economy that bullies us, which is basically what the domination and exploitation amounts to. And so if we have a comprehensive view of nonviolence and anti-bullying, for instance, that's a way to kind of polemically but clearly put the issues into sharp relief without folks having to read Engels and Julius Nyerere or whoever folks want to read. But the third thing I think is important to lift up is how we can have a meaningful both and of getting to socialism through cooperative activity and building a democratic economy, community land trust, co-ops, public banking, those sorts of things, and using state power to help us get there, because there's often more overlaps than I think we sometimes account for. I'm thinking of Eric Olin Wright's text, Building Real Utopias, but also very practically in New York City, the city council has provided some startup capital for cooperative funds. And so to the extent that we have community institutions who are justly suspicious of the state, particularly in communities of color, pushing to get the resources we need, that's a way to have a principled both and rather than a bland both and.
I love that, the principled both and rather than a bland both and. I think that's exactly right. The dialectic here is really important, right? Of building on the communities that are doing and practicing and then demanding, as Jessica's laid out here. Micah and Ed, I want to give you a chance to jump in here, or I've got another question queued up for us here, but I want to give us space. Great. So then what I want to do now is I want to talk a little bit about, so there's one question actually in the in the Q&A that I think we can actually address here now. And this is around the label of socialist. Micah, I wonder if we can start with you on this. And then what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about getting our analysis right. So let's start with that, Micah. What is the, why call socialists and call ourselves socialists, and what's the utility in the term? Talk with this thorny question here for us.
Sure, I'm sensitive to where the question is coming from as somebody who isn't really interested in just donning a label so that I can wear it proudly and alienate other people in the process, but at least feel good about myself and my moral rectitude or whatever. I mean, I'm interested in actually changing the world. This is maybe one reason why for many years in my life I sort of hid my socialism under a bushel, but I'm going to let it shine now. There is no better political term for the kind of distinct moral vision that we have that socialism entails, and that I think that in this country it for many decades was such a toxic term precisely because we had a whole Red Scare, McCarthyism. I mean, McCarthyism was about making this term toxic and making anyone who was associated with it toxic, precisely because the FBI and everybody else understood that it was so morally powerful. I mean, and of course, if you look at the history of the socialist movement around the rest of the world, there's that answers that question. You see the role that it's played elsewhere. And so there is this sort of unique, the moral and political framework that it has, that it is clear on, that it lifts up the working class and poor majority, and says that it is a tiny minority in the capitalist class that is sort of structurally compelled to try to wring as much profit and to often make the vast majority's lives as miserable as possible. We don't get that from any other that same kind of clarity from any other term that I'm aware of. I think the original question asked something about, why can't we call ourselves progressive Christians? Well, just to leave progressive Christians aside and just talk about progressives, I mean, all kinds of people, everybody right now is happy to claim that term, right? Everybody wants to be called a progressive at this term. I mean, I think, Hillary Clinton, when she ran for president in 2016, called herself a progressive, but I would consider the kind of politics that she represented and that she has, what her record is on politics is not one that is anywhere near the kind of clear moral vision that I have. So I think it's a term that we can't dispense with, because it does give us that kind of just a clear political vision that nothing else gives us, and the fact that it has this stigma attached to it is not a reason to abandon it. I mean, the real question, especially as Christians, I feel, is the term the one that expresses the vision of the world that we want to win or not. And if it is, then we have to say loudly and proudly that this is what we are. And luckily enough for us, we're in a period where it is nowhere near as alienating as it was even 6, 7, 8 years ago. We're in a time when there are all these wild polls that keep coming out that say, young people, like a majority of young people, consider themselves as socialists rather than capitalists. Maybe they're a little fuzzy on the details, but people are not scared of this term in the same way that they were even a short time in the past. So I don't think there's any reason for all of us to hide our politics under the bushel.
Go for it.
I'm not advocating not using the term or hiding it, but I want to make clear that we need to understand that when we say that to somebody, people hear you saying different things. So for some people, if you say you're a socialist, that means like Mao. For some people, it means like Stalin. For some people, it means like Castro. For not all that many people, it means like Micah, because more people are confused by what they think some other people did some other part of the world. So there's a gigantic narrative in the United States among many people. this is no different from talking about what does it mean when somebody says they're a Christian. If somebody walks up to me and says, I'm a Christian, I don't know what they mean. I have to ask, well, what does that mean to you? Because only after that do I have any sense at all of whether I should run and hide, cover my head, because they, Christian nationalists are some frightening people in many parts of the world. I mean, so this doesn't help. So I think that we should never become complacent with choosing what is the most appropriate label and using that without recognizing that our task remains to explain to people what we really stand for, what we believe. And that should go for the Christians on the call, as well as the socialists on the call and the rest of it, because people don't know what you're talking about. So a lot of times people ask me, do you believe in God? I have to ask them, well, what do you mean by God? And then the response for so many people is going to be, well, you know what I mean. And the fact of the matter is, I don't know what they mean. I really, really don't. And so if I were to tell somebody, somebody asked me, are you a socialist? I would have to ask you, like, what do you mean by that? Do you believe in the state taking everybody's property and putting people in jail and banning religion? It's like, well, no, I don't believe in that. Oh, okay, good. I was scared you were a socialist, because that's what they do. So we can never be satisfied with a label as though it somehow lends clarity, when we ought to be talking longhand every chance we get. So one of the things I practice is to be able to describe what I'm talking about in language that's clear enough and simple enough, often using the label much later. And again, recognizing that the fight over that label is a long-term fight. Just because you explain what you mean by socialism, some people may leave thinking, he an idiot. He thinks that stuff he talking about is socialism. What real socialism is what the Soviet Union did to Hungary in 1956 when it smashed those people's lives. I mean, that's a longer term kind of discussion. And I think that really we should spend a lot of time long-handing rather than shorthanding how we talk about what we believe and the changes we see that need to be made, and what's wrong with the existing system in language that people can understand, and what a system that would replace it would look like rather than what it would be called. Quite frankly, we don't know what people are going to end up calling it. We really don't. That's off into the future. We don't know. But right now, we can tell people some of the features we would hope that it needs to have, and hope that we're moving people in that way. And so that as we build particular institutions, so when you're building a worker co-op in your town, or a co-op grocery store, or a co-op housing unit, the question of whether or not you're a socialist should not be the litmus test around whether or not you should be participating in that effort, but rather whether or not you're trying to improve community, help meet people's needs, elevate the quality of life in a way that has a collective orientation to it, so that we're not enhancing the power and privilege of a handful of people, a few. And that's a description I can make clear enough so people know what I'm talking about, whether they agree or not.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. I agree with you. I actually don't like terminology or labels, and a lot for the reasons that you already said. I just wanted to add a couple things, and then to get back to the word socialism itself. Yeah, I prefer to talk. I forget, everybody's quoting little quotes. You said something about the description, belong on the description or whatever. I usually say, let's talk about the principles and values. That's what I care more about. But it's also because I want the description, right? I don't want us to shorthand this stuff because there's too many people make too many assumptions. We don't have enough national dialogue about what we really want. We fight terminology all the time, but don't really talk about the details. So I agree with you totally. I like to focus on what are our principles and values, and what is our vision for what that world is going to look like, and not worry about the terminology so much. I agree that we need to take back socialism from the red baiting and all that kind of stuff. So I'm fine with that. But in terms of personally, what I think will get us ahead, I think we need to talk about the details, where we're going, what we want, and how, again, back to the practice, right? Practice of doing it and articulating why we're doing it, giving that systemic analysis and the discussion of the principles and values that we're basing it on. The other problem of why I actually don't call myself a socialist is because I actually don't think socialism is enough. I want to go past socialism. I've been struggling for a terminology. I don't have a good one. I sometimes talk about solidarity, cooperative commonwealth, a womanist solidarity, cooperative commonwealth. But I don't have any good terms, but I can give you a long description, a deep description of what I want, what the principles and practices and values would be. And so I do, and it's harder, right? We live in a world that we're used to throwing around short term, making allusions to things and whatever. And that's what people expect. But I don't think we can do that. I think this movement, we have to now say, there is no one word for what we want. There is no, right? None of the words are exactly right. But this is what we want, right? We need, right, all these, non-exploitation. We need racial justice. We need gender justice. We need collective decision making. We need, and we can just keep listing those things. But I think that's where we have to move toward, and forget about the shorthand. I don't think it's going to get us anywhere.
I'd love to add in here, because I think there's an important point about not being doctrinaire as it relates to labels. There is a dimension of this that I think it's important to engage in a bit of persuasive work to build a consensus, however held, and that is a somewhat shared sense of causation, how we got into this mess in the first place and what it is that we're trying to oppose. And I think whether we call that anti-capitalist or whether we call that a wealth accumulation system that sanctifies and throws holy water on the wealth accumulation process. That's basically what James Baldwin talks about in The Fire Next Time, the sanctification of power. If we have a shared causal diagnosis, it makes it more likely that whether we're pushing in autonomous politics, anarchist politics, cooperative directions, a kind of evolutionary social democracy that gets us towards a socialism that respects civil liberties, if we start from that core, that gets us there. And a part of how we get to that shared sense of what the problem is a deep, thoroughgoing political education in labor unions, deep political education and popular education in Christian contexts, in other religious contexts, and viewing thoughts and prayers when radicalized as not the enemy of contentious action, but actually the fuel and the condition for contentious action. Because if we just give people politics over here and their thoughts and prayers are accommodationist, are revanchist, we'll never get to where we want to go. So I think it's important for people's interior space, your thoughts, your prayers, whatever you do with your solitude, which is how some define religion, for that to be radicalized in a healing, but also non-fatalist way with respect to society, so that we know when we come together, we can push towards the world we want to see.
Yeah, just very briefly, that I hear and agree with much of what all of you just said, and hear what Jessica is saying. Paul Tillich once said about Christianity that that he found Christianity, he was sort of shacked up with Christianity because it had this sort of built-in anti-idolatrousness to it in the first commandment, right, which was at least gave the potential for the religion to not take itself too seriously, to not become idolatrous. We know that it's failed in that many times, but that's built into the stuff of Christianity. And I do kind of feel a similar thing about democratic socialism, and that it's a very capacious kind of ideology, one that includes all kinds of, the feminist organizing, anti-racism, etc., a space for the need for a party and the need for labor organizing, but also a space for cooperative economics. And certainly an ideology that has roundly condemned the worst of the crimes that have been committed in the name of socialism, the kind of idolatrous and brutal forms of socialism that we saw under Stalin and under Mao. So just a half a word in there in defense of the ideology as one that is broad enough to include all of the kinds of things that we've been discussing tonight is not a particularly narrow one, which is the reason why I am someone who subscribes to it. I mean, I think that the Democratic Socialists of America exploded maybe in part because Bernie called himself a democratic socialist, and that people, when they Googled democratic socialism, they found the DSA, but also because it's an institution that does have that kind of broadness to it that is not sort of claiming to have a singular answer about, we are the ones who could tell you how the world needs to look, and so come and follow us, rather than an ideology in which we're all bringing all of these different strands together to create one movement that can build the kind of world that we want. So I just think that it is democratic socialism, certainly democratic socialism of the DSA in 2021 is a very broad category that can mean all the kinds of things that we want to see.
I really appreciate that, Mike, and everybody's points here. I think this is really an important issue for us to discuss, particularly because of the challenge that Ed raised for us here, which is that the challenges that socialism face are equally as high for those of us who call ourselves Christians. And so the good work of clarifying what it is we mean when we, call ourselves specific names is really important work to do. And doubling down on the values and the stories and the relationships is the necessary work to actually paint a picture of the type of community we're inviting people into. But that's slow and patient work. We don't, it's in an age when everything is captured in, however many characters for Twitter, it's this organizing work is necessarily going to be slow and patient. But I just, as we're kind of gearing towards our end time here, I want to talk about two more points. One is the idea that Andrew raised here about, at least within a term that allows us to understand the sort of getting the causation right, getting the analysis right. And I think Jessica and Ed, and you two have mentioned this a number of times, particularly if we're thinking about the movement of democratic socialism, often people think about it merely just as politics. But I think it's really important, especially here within the work of the Wendland-Cook Program, we're working consistently to bring religion and labor together, religious communities and cooperative economics together, and worker cooperatives, to show that this is actually the way that you live out your faith. So that does that sort of redefining of religion here. But I want to talk a little bit about making sure that class analysis doesn't fall out, and economic power doesn't fall out of this analysis here. So what's the advantage here of making sure that class power and economic democracy are central to this broad umbrella term of democratic socialism or economic democracy today? What's the advantage of centering class and economic democracy there?
I think that there is a huge amount of confusion around issues of class in the United States, that seldom is there a systemic, consistent class analysis that's applied to anything. That a lot of people have used class in such a way as to obscure the relations that people have to the economic life of the country, so that some kind of way everybody wants to be or claims to be middle class in a way that has just always confused me. Middle of what? Then the term working class has become recently used as a description of conservative white people in general. Even if they were small shop owners, they would be called working class. And it's like, really? The distortion of the economy itself that's come with late stage capitalism has led to part of the confusion where large amounts of the productive capacity of productive labor, which would have been in a classically developed capitalist system, which would have been industrial proletarian and all that kind of stuff, has been shifted overseas, and you have large numbers of people in service industries. You have large numbers of people who are not actively working consistently in various kind of precarious positions, some of whom are actually engaged in small commodity production rather than working class labor anyway, because they cut hair or cut grass or cut something and want to get paid for what they cut. And so there's just a lot of confusion around it. I think we need to reintroduce a class analysis into it because of the fundamental nature of how people's economic life does serve as a foundation for everything else. And without it, I tell people, I said, food is so important. If I don't have any food for 2 or 3 days, I get really grumpy. And so it's just really, really an important part of my life. Sometimes less than 2 or 3 days. So that we ought to be thinking about that, but we have mechanized farming that obscures the relationship between humans and the earth itself, and and where food comes from. We have these service economies, and we know people don't eat services as such, so it's not really a service economy, but that's what you kind of make it look like. So I think part of the task, part of the problem is we need to develop a much more sophisticated and consequently more accurate class analysis of what the country actually looks like. But then one of the things that is clear is that these gigantic piles of money that dominate life, that dominate and determine life and are held to be sacred, that these things should not be the controlling factor of how we live. And so that is the sense in which the class analysis has to point us toward the creation of a different kind of economic life in order to have the human freedom that is done away with by that pile of money and those people who control it being the defining factor that contributes and controls almost every aspect of life: education, entertainment, recreation, health services, the whole of it, dominated by a pile of money that's piled up over the years, which were ultimately produced by laboring people who don't tend to benefit from the pile of money that they created. So this is kind of what we have to be able to explain to people clearly in such a way that, again, elevates human freedom and the human meaning making and human spirituality and human needs being met to the primary place that those things belong, and let that pile of money, to the extent it's piled up or even takes the form of money, that pile of surplus that has been created, be something that is a tool, an instrument to enhance the things that are really important. That's what we've got to clarify. And in order to do that, we need a class analysis of who owns and controls these various aspects of things that I was just describing. And consequently, what does that mean in terms of the life of the vast majority who have actually created that wealth in the world?
Thank you for that, Jessica. And please go for it.
Yes, sorry. This is another place where labels are a problem, right? Because we're in such a dominated, hegemonic, capitalist, individualist system, right? Class also, just the use of the word class is red-baited too. It's just as bad as using communism and socialism, right? It's considered, right, that we're on the wrong track and we want to bring back, communist totalitarianism or whatever if we even talk about class. So I agree totally with what Ed said, but I want to add to that, we need to, this is where, popular education, popular economic literacy, right, is important. We need to be able to talk about this stuff. We need to be able to give the systemic analysis in a way that's meaningful. And one of the things that I've found is meaningful way to talk about this stuff is, first of all, to take a Marxist term, but I don't want us to get hung up with it being a Marxist term, but we're all alienated from our class relationships and from our class, right? But if you take away the terminology, when I start to talk to people about what they do in their everyday lives to survive, right? I tell people we're all economists, right? I became I got my PhD in economics because I wanted to demystify and liberate economics. And one of the ways to do that is to remind us we're all economists. We make economic decisions daily, 10, 20 times a day, right? But yet we're all made to think that we can't make any economic decisions, that we're not economists. We don't know the terminology. We don't know the right analysis. We don't understand it, right? But we budget, we make it, right? We do economic stuff all the time, every single day, from the minute we wake up to just before we go to bed to in our dreams, right? And yet we're alienated from that fact that we are economic agents. We make economic decisions all the time, and we're made to feel like we can't and we don't. So to me, that we need to even just start there, reminding us that we all do this. We know how to make economic decisions. We make them all the time. And we practice everyday economic solidarity in addition to being economic agents. And that we need to see that in ourselves, see it in the way that we interact with our families, our communities, our members, right? And then say, now, why can't we live, right? Why can't we have a system that we can live those principles, those activities, whatever? So I think that's one of the first things we have to do too, is instead of people being scared or feeling like it's something outside of them or different or separated from them, we have to, right, put it back in our hearts and our bodies and let people see it for themselves. So to me, that's really important. And then we need to help people again to feel like the vision of how we can transform the formal economy that we have to live under, right? We also need to feel like we can be a part of that transformation, right? That we don't just have to suffer under the current system. We don't just have to make do in the ways that we make do, but that we also have agency to be transformative. And again, it's hard, but once you get people doing little things, small things, that's the other thing, to just start small, little everyday things, just start doing small things, small little cooperative activities, small little whatever, and you see the power of it, and then you can do more things. And I could go into a whole thing about it, but I think we're running out of time, so I won't. But like, there's lots of examples of communities just doing small things, like making a playground for the kids, and then realizing that they have power to do something bigger than that and something more than that. And you build on that, doing a small buying club, and then you end up with a large grocery store, co-op grocery store, those kind of things. So there's lots of ways to talk about, right? First, claiming our agency, our humanity and our agency in the economic sphere, and then doing small but steady steps to create more and more things that help us transform the system that we do live under, and see that we can have and practice a different way.
Jessica, Andrew, I see you. I just want to really make sure that folk caught the really practical ways of engaging in this work that Jessica has just given us here. The cooperative movement is broad, and there's a number of different ways of entry points into this, from consumer co-ops to producer co-ops to then worker co-ops. She's offered you the encouragement to starting small, right, and looking around in your own community as a way to participate and amplify your own agency, to understand your class position in this, and then begin to grasp the transformative power of that. I think that shouldn't be missed here. That was really a very practical, important place for us. Andrew, I want to turn to you quickly. Please go for it.
Yeah, I want to share two quick things. One, in putting on my political scientist hat here, I think it's important to recover a sense of what Michael Dawson and others call linked fate, because a part of the ideology of capitalism suggests that we can secure a kind of beachhead of assets, and I can be fine independent of how your life goes, that our futures don't intersect or are not interwoven in any meaningful sort of sense. And I'll share a quick story about how I realized this kind of sense of linked fate. One of the first funerals I did was for a parishioner at a church that I was serving alongside my wife, who also pastors. We pastor together. And this is a brother who was in his 20s. He had a what we call now a pre-existing condition, and he wasn't able to get any health care because his insurance didn't see his condition as worth taking care of. And I remember just being so incredibly distraught at the injustice of having to preside over a funeral for someone whom God did not call, right? But who died unnaturally, who died unjustly because of changeable, malleable aspects of our healthcare system. And it dawned on me that this mutable sickness of the system that we live in is not just something that affects him. This is a system that we all share. And how many other folks in our congregations, in our communities, in our schools are suffering and buckling under this system. And so I think a part of what cooperative work does, a part of what shared political organizing does in churches, is it recovers this sense of, to put in larger context, a quote that MLK often said, that what happens to one of us directly affects all of us indirectly. And therefore we're caught up in this inescapable garment of mutuality, right? Which is the way of talking about link fake. And then that's when we get the popular quote that we say, injustice to anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Thank you for that. Well, friends, we're here at the point where I believe we've got time for about 1 or 2 questions, and we've got a number of questions. This has just been a phenomenal panel. Thank you. You've gifted us with your presence and your knowledge and your experience here so much. We've got a number of questions that have happened in the chat, but those that we're going to turn directly here on the Q&A. Micah, the one that's I want to start with you here because I think it's a really interesting one, which is sort of, how do you do organizing in an age of an echo chamber of social media? Let's talk about building economic and political power that requires real transformative, slow, patient work of organizing, when sometimes our attention spans don't seem to be built for it.
I don't know if I'm the right one to answer this as someone who's constantly trying to flee the echo chamber of social media, who, you know, deleted Twitter from my phone and feel like I'm a new man recently. I mean, I think that, well, anybody who would ask this question, I kind of already knows the basics of the answer, which is that, I mean, in my own example within the Democratic Socialists of America, for example, this organization would not have exploded in the way that it has, as Andrew mentioned, approaching 100,000 members, if it weren't for social media. And, you know, I'm someone who loves to talk about how miserable life is on social media, but it also is a way for, you know, prophetic voices, for, you know, voices of socialism and other kinds of leftist politics to break through the mainstream consensus in a way that wasn't available to us even not that long ago. I don't think that we would see campaigns like Bernie Sanders or an AOC's or other non-electoral kinds of organizing become as prominent as they become without social media being able to kind of do an end run around the gatekeepers of corporate media and sharing the message about these different kind of projects that we're working on. So I don't want to downplay it too much, but it's only useful insofar as it draws us into actual, you know, beloved community sort of in person together when such things are possible and safe, of course. And so I think that is, I mean, it's hard to, that has happened on the left right now. I kind of despair in my darker hours about our possibilities for that in our politics as a whole. I'm not opposed to conflict in politics. I think that's necessary, but we have just this sort of like conflict for its own sake that isn't attached to any kind of substantive political vision. I despair that that's sort of, we're just going to be stuck sort of spinning in those treads for forever. But I think that we've certainly seen in this newly reborn left that it is possible to sort of make that shift from the realm of social media and online into folks trying to rebuild the social, trying to rebuild a sphere where we actually have a sense of community that has been so, as I mentioned earlier, hollowed out over recent decades.
Thank you for that, Jessica. I saw you shared something in the chat on this too, so thank you for that. Friends, I also am going to put in the chat a forum for interventions in Wendland-Cook, where we talk about the relationship between churches and cooperatives. One participant in that is Nathan Schneider, who does a lot of work on this in building alternative cooperative forms of technological and social media engagement. So please check out his contribution there, and he's the source, I think, that can begin to practice and then demand all the alternative ways of living into this. For our final question, I want to turn to one of these that gets at the relationship of building class, while also building religious communities. This is a question that says, how do we understand the task of building this movement in relationship to religious communities, which are largely, but not everywhere, in decline? What's the connection between class analysis and the crisis in the church's part of what's interesting for this, and perhaps Andrew, you've got something to say on this, is sort of shifting away from the model of rent-a-caller about how it is that the left sees religion instrumentally as just sort of inviting a pastor there and sort of, okay, now that we've got the pastor there, that's great, but actually building on this moral relational foundation that Jessica started us out with, and that W.B. Du Bois found absolutely crucial to building a transformative alternative economic future. So what's the relationship there between class analysis and the crisis in the churches?
It's a really great question. And I, as someone who has suffered that peculiar injustice of rent-a-caller, I appreciate you drawing attention to that under-championed plight. I think one of the things that I think is particularly important is to that end, to acknowledge where religious folks are bringing powerful intellectual contributions and not solely bodies or in-kind space where people can meet, though those things are also wonderful. I think, for instance, of Reverend Delman Coates in Maryland, who's been a key figure working with a lot of folks in the modern monetary theory conversation that Stephanie Kelton and others have kind of popularized, to talk about how we can have certain kinds of central banks help us rethink how we can finance, rather than deficit mongering, the kinds of public goods access that we all care about. And so that's a kind of contribution that's coming to kind of radicalize how we think about stewardship. It's not just a personal matter of budgeting and household prudence with discretionary income, but there's actually a public facing dimension to this that puts monetary policy on the table. Because so often when we talk about what socialism and our pathways to economic justice, we focus on fiscal policy, right? And the kind of work that state legislatures and Congress and municipalities do. So I think it's important to focus on the fiscal policy, but also to have a monetary strategy as well, because we need a strong both and. And it's a really good essay series in Dissent magazine that I think addresses some of that conflict that I lift up. The second thing is, I'll start with what's not so great and then maybe speak to the possibilities. So often, one of the spaces where folks get de-radicalized in American context, probably the Americas generally, not just North America, is in churches. You know, Sunday school is often one of the most deeply individualistic, take the world and give me Jesus sorts of places. And so I think the possibility and opportunity that we have is to do the kind of work that the Wendland-Cook Program is doing at Vanderbilt, the kind of work that the Bias magazine is trying to do at the Institute for Christian Socialism, to make sure that in these Sunday school moments, in these kind of social justice team moments, these kind of small spaces where people are vulnerable enough to kind of not just swap opinions, but really get down to presuppositions about how the world works and that kind of root cause analysis that we talked about earlier. When that kind of work is done, we can get to a place where people are bringing more than just their presence, but they're bringing their prayers and their arguments and a vision for how we can get to a more justly ordered political economy.
Thank you for that. Any other panelists want to? I know we're over time, friends. I want to be respectful of our audience's time here. Any other final words?
I wanted to say a little bit about the. Were you speaking, Jessica?
It's okay. Go ahead. I'll speak after you.
Okay. I just want to say a little bit about our fascination with social media and the role that it has. It is as much a distraction as it is an enhancement in communication, because quite frankly, a lot of people waste time digging into rabbit holes that they could spend thinking with others and talking with their neighbors and building things. So as our organizing task is understood, we need to understand that no particular vehicle is going to be kind of morally decisive in how we go about doing our work. They have pluses and minuses, and the people did a lot of really, really incredible organizing work when there was no social media to depend upon. but it required them to go around knocking on people's doors and having conversations with them and meeting them in church halls and pool halls, quite frankly. And so that some of those are things that we might need to return to in addition to our utilization of other more modern but less personal kind of communication tools that really do have the weakness of allowing for this estrangement and alienation. You know, Marx theorized about alienation 150 years ago. Little did he know what it looks like in the 21st century. You know, but we have to figure that out. Nobody else can figure that out for us. We can't take 150-year-old lessons and simply apply them, even though we should certainly learn as much as we can from lessons that are 150 years old and the ones that are 2,000 years old, you know, as this conversation goes on.
Yeah, and I just want to put in there that, you know, we really have to start young. We have to start with the youngest, right? We have to start changing the way our young people see, think, do things, and what they see us doing and thinking. So I've been talking about changing kindergarten, and if we're talking in a religious context, change Sunday school. But I would love for us to end on a note where we're talking about that, you know, bringing up the young ones, because they're going to be the leaders one day. And if they don't know how to think or how to do these things, then we have no hope.
That's absolutely right. Well, friends, thank you so much. Jessica, Micah, Andrew, and Ed. This has been such an enriching conversation for me. I think our audience has really enjoyed it as well. Thank you, friends, for tuning in to the Engaging Christianities and Socialisms series. If you're interested on next steps, there's been a number of links that have been posted in the chat. Please check them out. And the Wendland-Cook program is going to be launching a number of continuing ed and training courses that will be available online that we'll make available for you over the summer. So we look forward to hearing you and engaging with you in that. Thank you again to the wonderful panelists. Have a good night.